October 20th, 2009. A Kmart parking lot in Pueblo, Colorado. A man steps from his car and stands perfectly still as police surround him. He does not run. He does not panic. He lets the handcuffs slip over his wrists and the officers lead him away. His name? Robert Howard Bruce. To one set of investigators, he is a suspect in an attempted murder investigation. To a wife at home, he is the man she married and trusted. To dozens of women across the Southwest, women who woke in their own beds with pounding heads, strange bruises, and no memory of the night before, he would soon have a far darker identity. The Ether Man, the man who used chemicals to erase a night from a woman's mind. That's the paradox at the center of this case. The violence was real. The evidence could be concrete. Yet so often the most important witness was the one that refused to speak, the victim's memory. Welcome to Unimaginable True Crimes. Here, we expose the unimaginable, one case at a time. This is not a story about a lurid stranger lurking in the bushes. This is a story about a predator who learned how to disappear in plain sight. He didn't rely on a mask or a weapon alone. He relied on a technique that turned the victim's own mind against her. Chemicals to render her unconscious, and then the calculated exploitation of the confusion that followed. For more than 2 decades, the Ether Man's pattern played out across states. Women who slept, women who woke violated, and vitally, women who could not testify to what happened because the memory itself had been stolen. That lack of memory created a second crime: years of doubt, internalized shame, and the near certain risk of not being believed. The timeline that investigators would eventually stitch together begins in the mid-1980s. The earliest linked incidents date back to the mid-1980s on college campuses and in apartments near universities and nightlife districts. Young women would return home from evenings out, fall asleep, and wake with fogged recollection. Many reported headaches, sore muscles, and clothing left disarrayed. In many cases, there was no sign of forced entry, a key indicator that the intruder used stealth or deception to enter, or that he had waited until an opportune moment to strike from within. Those early reports were, at the time, scattered. Different jurisdictions saw similar complaints, but lacked connecting threads. With limited forensic tools in the 1980s and early 1990s, these attacks were sometimes cataloged as isolated burglaries or as odd, unprovable violations. Victims were often told to secure their homes more tightly, or worse, that perhaps their own consumption of alcohol explained the gaps. The consequence was predictable. Predators who rely on erasing memories find fertile ground when victims are dismissed. Investigators later described a consistent method. The attacker would choose a target, often a young woman who lived alone or a college student, observe and possibly stalk for days, then act on an evening when the victim was alone. He used chemical agents, historically called ether in the press, and sometimes implied chloroform, delivered on a cloth or rag to render his victims unconscious. Reports indicate the attacker also sometimes used stun devices or handcuffs to restrain victims. The assaults were rapid and clinical, leaving behind forensic traces that would, decades later, be critical once DNA databases and technology improved. Because the victims could not reliably recount what had happened, those traces were essential. Samples preserved from the scenes, hair, skin cells, seminal fluid, would later become the forensic bridge to connect disparate assaults across multiple states. Local police in each city did their best with what they had. They canvassed neighborhoods, took statements, and drew rough composite sketches from the hazy recollections of shaken women. But the lack of a single jurisdictional lead and the absence of a named suspect meant cases sometimes languished. Detectives worked nights and days on paper trails and neighborhood checks, but the evidence frequently failed to form a prosecutable case. This is important to remember. Criminals who attack memory rather than life exploit the fault line in our justice system. Our system often depends on credible testimony. When testimony is absent, even the most diligent detective can be hamstrung. That is the environment Robert Bruce learned to exploit. Robert Howard Bruce did not look like a monster in a wanted poster. He looked, at first glance, like someone many people would trust. A man with a stable job, a competent manner, a family history he could talk about with ease. He had work as an intelligence technician, a job that offered routine, credibility, and mobility across states. This job also provided a useful cover for frequent travel and plausible alibis. It is worth pausing on that detail. Many serial predators build their lives around plausible normalcy. Stability is camouflage. Employment provides travel and excuses for absence. A family background can serve as a performance of responsibility. The pattern that emerged in interviews with victims and later in Bruce's own accounts, once he spoke in custody, shows a man invested in patience and study. He would watch, test, and learn. In places with smaller police resources and with transient student populations, he had opportunities to observe and choose vulnerable targets. Part of his method included appearing helpful, even paternal. He knew how to listen, how to offer a small kindness that later served as a foothold. That kind behavior, a ride home, a gift, an offer of help, was part of the mask that allowed him to move unnoticed. The early Albuquerque cases involved young women who returned home late and woke in the morning with confusion. One of the first victims later said she had noticed nothing extraordinary before sleep. When she woke, she felt violated and frightened, but unable to name an attacker or produce clear descriptors. These gaps were not failing of memory alone. They were the intent of the criminal act. The ether man literally took the night from his victims, and with it, the primary witness. Because those early cases were not widely publicized together, the community response at the time was piecemeal. Increased neighborhood patrols in certain zones, advice about locking doors, and, tragically, victims who began to doubt themselves when friends or officials suggested alternative explanations. Predators who build a system are frighteningly efficient. This man developed techniques tailored to small apartments and student dwellings. He tested doors and porches, sometimes disabling porch lights. He learned which windows or doors were most likely to be unlocked. He realized that drugs that limited memory were the most damning weapon, because a sleeping woman cannot give a face to the crime. Over time, similar assaults were reported in cities where Bruce traveled for work. The pattern, the timeline, the chemical usage, the profile of victims began to look less like coincidence and more like the work of an itinerant offender. Joy Lynn Martinez was not searching for a nightmare. She was a single mother, working long hours, raising 2 young sons, and fighting daily to keep her household afloat. Exhaustion and responsibility shape how most people make choices. A partner who promises relief and emotional safety is not a luxury, but a survival strategy. Enter Robert Howard Bruce. He was 12 years her senior. He spoke about his children and his sacrifices. He offered support, soon lavish gifts and romantic gestures, an intoxicating contrast to Joy Lynn's everyday strain. From the vantage point of a survivor's later reflections, the courtship reads like a textbook case of grooming. Gifts, attention, assurance of stability. When Joy Lynn married him in 2003, a ceremony in Hawaii that crystallized her hope for refuge, she believed in the man who said he would care for her and her boys. She could not have known that while his gestures were real, they were applied as part of a longer strategy to appear as the opposite of the predator he had been. This paradox points to a painful truth. Some abusers are skilled performers, used to playing roles that protect them. Their deception is as much social as it is criminal. After the marriage, behavior shifted. The generosity that had felt like rescue began to look like control. Small financial impairments, criticism, a pattern familiar to anyone who studies intimate partner abuse, escalating psychological tactics that isolate, humiliate, and create dependency. Joy Lynn learned to walk on eggshells, anticipating explosions and calming him afterward in the hope the apologies would restore the safe version of their life. Those cycles, the intermittent charm interspersed with cruelty, are precisely how predators maintain power. The goal is not simply to dominate, it's to ensure the victim doubts her own perceptions and social options. In 2006, Joy Lynn found a list hidden among her husband's belongings. Names, cities across the Southwest where Robert had traveled for work. She found addresses. The hair on her neck rose, but she lacked context. Then, a videotape, recorded by her husband, that shattered any remaining illusion. She watched herself on screen, motionless, unresponsive, while a shadowed figure moved in. The footage showed an assault while she was unconscious. The knowledge that her husband had violated her while she slept was devastating. It also answered a larger, more terrifying question. Could a man living across several states be connected to the assaults that had baffled authorities for decades? Joy Lynn confronted him. His response was sterile, almost clinical, denial without remorse. Her next choices were not purely emotional, they were strategic. Leaving an abuser controlling the finances and the space of your life is risky, but staying means ongoing risk to you and your children. Many victims make decisions that seem confounding to outsiders because the calculus for survival is different when danger is immediate. Late September 2009, Pueblo police investigate a curious device, a propane tank rigged to vent combustible gas toward a family's home, a home belonging to an officer set to testify against Robert Bruce in a misdemeanor Peeping Tom case. The device failed to explode, but the attempt was undeniable. Someone had tried to kill an entire family to silence a potential witness. That someone was Bruce. He was arrested at a Kmart parking lot on a quiet October evening and taken into custody. The motive, terrifyingly clear, was to avoid being compelled to submit DNA to a sex offender database, where his genetic profile would be compared to evidence from unsolved sexual assaults. This attempted murder did what earlier assaults could not. It placed Bruce in front of investigators in a way that demanded scrutiny beyond the Peeping Tom case. The bomb tied into a broader pattern of obsession with secrecy. Bruce had been under suspicion locally for some voyeuristic offenses. A conviction would require DNA submission. For someone already possibly linked to many assaults, that was an existential threat. He would rather silence a witness than risk exposure. That desperate calculus, murder to avoid DNA submission, is chilling, but also revealing. Bruce understood modern policing and forensic linkage. His attempt to stop the process shows both his sophistication and his desperation. Once Bruce was in custody, cross-jurisdictional cooperation accelerated. DNA from evidence preserved from decades-old sexual assaults was compared to Bruce's newly obtained profile. Matches began to appear. Where once there had been only scattered reports and fuzzy composites, there was now a biochemical signature tying a man to assaults across multiple jurisdictions. Agencies that had worked separate cases, Albuquerque, Norman, Austin, Lubbock, saw overlapping genetic fingerprints. Those fingerprints matched Bruce. Later, prosecutors and police announced that Bruce had confessed in some interviews to certain attacks. He provided details that only an offender would know. The combination of DNA and confession created the structural skeleton needed to convict. News outlets carried the story. An intelligence technician who had married and fathered a blended family was accused of being the Ether Am, the drugger rapist who had terrorized women and left a trail of bewildered victims. Public reaction was complicated. Shock for neighbors, fury and relief for identified victims, and for others, a dawning sense of vindication. Joy Lynn stepped forward to tell police what she had discovered, the list of names, the videotape of her own assault, and the pattern of Robert's travel. That testimony, combined with forensic evidence, unspooled the case across state lines. Once DNA linked Bruce to the assaults, state prosecutors moved methodically. In New Mexico, Bruce pleaded guilty to multiple rape counts and received a massive sentence. An Albuquerque court in 2012 imposed 156 years on the New Mexico charges. In Oklahoma, prosecutors obtained guilty pleas and convictions that led to additional decades. Cleveland County prosecutions in 2013 added 177 years on top of Colorado and New Mexico sentences. Colorado itself had already sentenced Bruce for attempted murder and explosives convictions tied to the Pueblo device. State courts handed him decades there as well. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. Robert Howard Bruce would spend the remainder of his life in custody. In sum, the penalty exceeded 220 years when you combine sentences across states and counts. The headline read like symbolic justice, a life imprisoned for a life taken from many others. But the reality for victims and their families was more complex. The legal verdicts provided formal accountability, but they could not erase years of trauma. For many victims who had spent years doubting their own experiences, the prosecutions offered a crucial and painful validation. These are not small victories. Decades of internal questions, whispered doubts, and social pressure to dismiss the experience can be devastating. When DNA says your attacker is the person identified, when a defendant pleads guilty, when a jury convicts, those moments answer the harshest domestic question a survivor can face. Was it real? The answer, for many, became undeniable. For Joy Lynn, her role in bringing the case to light was both salvific and costly. Her courage in coming forward, revealing the videotape and the list, helped unlock a chain of prosecution that spanned jurisdictions. One of the hardest lessons in this case is systemic. Technologies like DNA databases are only as powerful as the efforts to compel suspects to submit profiles and as the cooperation between agencies to compare them. The Etherman case was solved in great part because of a chain of mistakes. The suspect's arrest in an unrelated matter, the compelled DNA submission during criminal proceedings, and the preservation of evidence from old scenes. Where any of those links had been absent, the case might have been left cold. That should be a warning and a guide. It is a reminder to law enforcement to preserve evidence, to pursue cross-jurisdictional comparisons, and to treat victims' reports with the gravity they deserve. So many early complaints in the 1980s and 1990s were minimized because the victims could not narrate the attack. That failure gave Bruce years to operate. A prison sentence does not guarantee healing. For survivors, the aftermath is a long arc of therapy, legal advocacy, and the slow work of restoring trust in the self. Many victims testify in court for reasons beyond conviction. They need the public narrative corrected. They need to remove the doubt placed upon them. They need to know that a system heard their fragmentary stories and acted. The Etherman's incarceration also raises questions about broader prevention. How do we educate the public about predators who use chemicals? How do universities and police better protect students? How do neighbors and friends avoid the reflex to doubt survivors who report memory gaps? The Robert Howard Bruce case is both horrifying and instructive. It is an example of how a predator can live an ordinary life while committing profoundly evil acts. It is also an example of a system that eventually worked, not flawlessly, but eventually, to recognize and punish repeated harm. And finally, it is a story about courage. Victims who, after years of doubt, found the voice to say what had happened. As investigators said at the time, Bruce offered to teach authorities how he had avoided detection. He told them in a dark way of his strategies and the small oversights that allowed him to continue. That confession, draped in arrogance, nonetheless provided a rare roadmap that law enforcement used to bring closure to multiple cases. If there is a single takeaway, it is this: predators can hide behind normalcy. They can be the reliable coworker, the helpful neighbor, the romantic partner who gives roses after an argument. That makes them harder to spot and easier to rationalize away. But when a survivor speaks, the right response is not suspicion. It is a careful, methodical investigation. Preserve evidence, listen, and when technology gives us tools like DNA comparison, use them aggressively to connect the dots across cities and time.
This case was solved because a survivor finally spoke, because an attempted murder sparked investigation, and because forensic science caught up. The Etherman's reign of secrecy ended, but the human consequences, the trauma and distrust remain. If a crime steals your memory instead of your life, how should the justice system treat the victim's experience when there's little or no testimony? What warning signs, if any, do you think people around Robert Howard Bruce could have noticed sooner, if any at all? Do you believe justice was truly served in this case, or are long prison sentences never enough for crimes that destroy decades of lives? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If this investigation resonated with you, like the video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, turn on notifications for the next investigative documentaries. Your support keeps these stories alive and accurate.